everybody, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to the H.H. Holmes series. When we last left off, Holmes had done away with Mr. Benjamin Pitezel, absconded with basically all of Carrie Pitezel's insurance money, and taken 3 of the Pitezel children away from their mother, telling Carrie that he was going to be keeping them safe until they could all be reunited with their father. Over the following weeks, Holmes would travel around North America with his wife Georgiana, Alice Pitezel, and the Pitezel children divided into 3 groups. Georgiana was often left to her own devices. Nellie, Alice, and Howard Pitezel were together, and Carrie Pitezel was with her remaining 2 children. He would buy them all tickets on the same train usually, but he would make sure they were seated in different carts. When they arrived in each city, he would check them into different hotels, ensuring that they would never run into each other. The 3 Pitezel children that were not with their mother would often write to her, thinking that she was in Illinois with their grandparents, and Carrie Pitezel thought that Holmes was bringing her kids to her husband, Ben, who was in hiding. It's very difficult to get an exact timeline of where these groups traveled and how long they remained in each city, but with the help of Adam Seltzer's book, as well as the website H.H. Holmes Trial, we are able to get a basic rough outline. Between September 28th and the 30th, we know that Holmes, Nellie, Alice, and Howard were in Cincinnati, Ohio. On September 29th, he and the children checked into the Atlantic House Hotel under the name Alex E. Cook. The next day, they checked out and went to another Cincinnati hotel, the Bristol Hotel, once again only staying for 1 night before moving again. During these 2 days, it seems that Holmes also rented a small house at 305 Poplar Street in Cincinnati, a neighborhood that Chris Smith, who's a reference librarian of genealogy and local history at the Cincinnati Library, described as an old neighborhood with row houses, commercial activity, and industrial grit mixed with established churches, schools, breweries, slaughterhouses, stables, and a plentiful supply of saloons. Later, the next-door neighbor of this house, a woman named Mrs. Hill, who lived at 303 Poplar, reported that she witnessed Holmes pull up to the house in a big wagon, and a young boy who she identified as Howard Pitezel was with him. She also watched Holmes unload a large cylindrical stove, which he then brought into the rented house. Now, it is believed that Holmes meant to kill Howard Pitezel that day and put his body into the stove to burn the remains beyond recognition before leaving the stove in the house and traveling on. But he saw Mrs. Hill watching and evidently abandoned this plan, feeling it was now too risky with an eyewitness. The next day, Holmes knocked on Mrs. Hill's door and told her that he had changed his mind about staying in Cincinnati, and he wondered if she would like the stove for herself since he would now have no use for it. After this, Holmes gathered up the 3 Pitezel children and went back to Indianapolis, where he would stay from the 30th of September to the 12th of October. Sadly, however, little Howard would never leave Indianapolis. Now, before we continue on, let's have a word from the sponsor of this video, Native. Native wants to empower people to use cleaner personal care products and also empower people to look closer at the ingredient list behind their daily personal care items like deodorant, body wash, soap, and toothpaste. I think we can all agree it is important to take care of our bodies because it's the only one we get. It's the only place we get to live. But we also want to take care of the earth because there's no other place like it in the universe, which is why, due to popular demand, Native has created a line of plastic-free deodorants. The packaging is made from 100% paperboard, sourced from responsibly managed forests. And Native is also a proud partner of 1% for the Planet, committing 1% of plastic-free deodorant sales to environmental nonprofits. Now, although the packaging looks a little different, it's still the same great product you know and love inside. Deodorant made with familiar and clean ingredients such as coconut oil and shea butter, but never made with parabens, sulfates, or aluminum. Native's deodorants are not sticky, clumpy, or chalky, and they dry incredibly fast, making them the perfect choice for when you're on the go, or if you just don't want deodorant marks on your clothes. And best of all, they last all day, even after exercising, even after sweating in front of these lights for hours at a time. And native products are always vegan and cruelty-free. I also love that they have seasonal scents, like my favorite from fall, which was apple and honeysuckle. I can't wait for it to come back. And now my new favorite for winter, which is candy cane, because I love the smell. But if you don't like candy cane, there are plenty to choose from, such as coconut and vanilla. So maybe you can forget it's winter and imagine yourself on a white sand beach somewhere. 3 plastic-free deodorants are normally $39, but if you use the link in the description box and use the code StephanieH5, you can get them for $29. That's 25% off, and Native offers free shipping to the US. Once again, just click the link in the description box and use the code StephanieH5. Thank you so much to Native for sponsoring this video and this channel, and also for keeping me dry and smelling like an actual candy cane all day long. And thanks to all of you who understand that sponsors are essential to this channel and they allow me to keep bringing you content. Let's dive back into the video. On September 30th, Holmes checked the 3 children into the English Hotel in Indianapolis under the name Canning, which was their mother's maiden name. Holmes and his wife Georgiana, under the names Mr. and Mrs. Howard, checked into the Circle Park Hotel, owned and operated by a widow named Maria Rhodius. Holmes himself wasn't there much, but Georgiana was there for the majority of the time and only left her room to take her meals. On October 1st, Holmes checked the children out of the English Hotel and into the Circle House Hotel, which is different than the Circle Park Hotel, but they sound very similar, don't they? And the Circle House Hotel and the Circle Park Hotel were only a block away from each other. Now, Holmes had told the owner of the hotel that he was the uncle to these children and their widow mother would be joining them there in a few days. Both Alice and Nellie seemed to prefer Indianapolis to Cincinnati, as can be seen in letters they wrote to their mother while in the city. Alice wrote to her mother, Carrie, quote, "Dear Mama, we was in Cincinnati yesterday, and we got here last night getting the telegram from Mr. Howe yesterday afternoon. Mr. H is going tonight for you, and he will take this letter. We went, us 3, over to the Zoological Gardens in Cincinnati yesterday and saw all the different kinds of animals. We saw the ostrich. It is about a head taller than I am, so we know about how high it is. And the giraffe? You have to look up into the sky to see it. I like it lots better here in Indianapolis than Sin. There is a monument right in front of the hotel where we are at, and I should judge that it is about 3 times the height of a 5-story building. I guess I have told all the news, so goodbye." End quote. Nellie also wrote to her mother, saying, quote, "We have a room right in front of a monument, and I think it was A. Lincoln's. Come as soon as you can because I want to see you and baby too. It is an awful nice place where we are staying. I don't think you would like Cincinnati either, but Mr. H says he likes it there. Goodbye, your doll, Nellie Peitzel." End quote. The monument that both Alice and Nellie were referring to was the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, a limestone obelisk built in 1888 that still stands at One Monument Circle in Indianapolis, towering 284 feet into the sky. The monument was meant to honor those who fought and died in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the Frontier Wars, as well as the Spanish-American War. Now, one of the saddest parts about all of this was that Carrie Peitzel would never receive these words of love from her daughters. Holmes told the children he would get their letters to their mother, but he never delivered them to her. He just held on to them. The children remained at the Circle House Hotel for 10 days. At some point, it is reported that Holmes mentioned to the hotel manager that little Howard was a very bad boy, and he was attempting to find a new place for the youngster, maybe an institution. This same man, who was called Mr. Ackalow, remembered that none of the children seemed very happy there, and when he would send someone to their room to bring them down for their meals, they would often be crying for their mother, wondering why she was not responding to their many thoughtful letters. And although Carrie Peitzel had not responded to any of her children's many letters, they kept writing. Most likely there was nothing else to do, stuck in a hotel room alone, all day, every day, with only the hope that the more they wrote, the sooner they could see their mother and have their lives go back to normal. The children did go on some trips around the city, and they were given pocket money to purchase what they liked, but reading their letters is absolutely heartbreaking, knowing they would never see their mother or their older sister or their baby brother again, and knowing that this was what they wanted most in the world. On October 6th, 9-year-old Nellie wrote, quote, "Dear Mama, Grandma, and Grandpa, we are all well here. It is a little bit warmer today. There's so many buggies that go by you can't hear yourself think. There was a poor boy arrested yesterday for stealing a shirt. He said he had no home. The policeman said he would buy him a suit of clothes and then send him to a reform school. I saw 2 great big ostriches alive, and we felt of their feathers. They are awful smooth. They are as big as a horse. Why have buffaloes got big rings in their noses for? I want Grandma and Grandpa to write to me. Is the baby well, and does he like cocoa? I want you all to write. Why don't you write, Mama?" End quote. Now, Alice Peitzel, as the oldest, was expected to be the adult and care for her younger siblings while they were stowed away at this hotel, and she was not too happy about it. On October 6th, 1894, she also wrote a letter saying, quote, "We are all well, except I have got a bad cold, and I have read so much in Uncle Tom's book that I could not see to write yesterday when Nell and Howard did. I am wearing my new dress today because it is warmer today. Nell, Howard, and I have all got a crystal pen made of glass, 5 cents apiece, and I'm writing with it now. I expect Grandma and Grandpa was awful glad to see you. Last Sunday, we was at the Zoological Gardens in Cincinnati, and I expect this Sunday will pass away slower than I don't know what, and Howard is too dirty to be seen out on the street today. Why don't you write to me? I have not got a letter from you since I have been away, and it will be 3 weeks day after tomorrow. The hotel is just a block from Washington Street, and that is where all the big stores are. There's a shoe store there, and there has been a man painting every day this week. They give these genuine oil paintings away with every $1 purchase of shoes, with small extra charge for frames. You can't get the pictures without the frames, though. I wish I could get one. You don't know how pretty they are. We go there every day and watch him paint. He can paint a picture in 10 minutes. Ain't that quick? This letter is for you all because I can't write to so many of you. I guess I have told all the news, so goodbye. Love to all, and kisses. P.S. Write soon." End quote. A few days later, Alice wrote to her mother again, suggesting that she had received a letter from Carrie, which I suspect was not actually from her mother, but was written by Holmes himself to pacify the sad children. In this letter, Alice shows her frustration with her little brother Howard, who seemed to have been going a bit stir-crazy. And the letter said, quote, "Mama, just got a letter from you saying the babe was cross and Desi and Grandma were sick. How is Grandpa? Hope you will all feel better. I don't like to tell you, but you asked me, so I will have to tell you. H won't mind me at all. He wanted a book, and I got a Life of General Sheridan, and it's awful nice, but now he don't read it at all hardly. One morning, Mr. H told me to tell him to stay in the next morning, that he wanted him and he would come and get him and take him out, and I told him he would not stay in at all. He was out when he came. We have written 2 or 3 letters to you, and I guess you will begin to get them now. I've just finished Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it is a nice book. I wish I could see you all." End quote. Can we just pause a moment to wonder why Alice thought that her 7-year-old brother would be entertained by A Life of General Sheridan? I mean, was he like a child prodigy or something? But Alice was understandably feeling frustrated by being in charge of her younger brother and sister, but if she had known what was in store for each of them, maybe she would have been a bit kinder and more patient. Within 2 days, little Howard would be dead, and after that, Nellie and Alice would soon be as well. According to court documents, on October 3rd, Holmes, accompanied by Howard, brought 2 cases of surgical instruments into a repair shop owned by Albert Schiffling, and he requested that they be sharpened. On October 5th, Holmes rented the Lancaster House, a cottage on Union Avenue in the Indianapolis suburb of Irvington. Mr. Brown, the real estate agent who gave Holmes the key, said, quote, "I remember the man very well because I did not like his manner. I felt that he should have had more respect for my gray hairs." End quote. Apparently, Holmes had been very short with Mr. Brown after renting the cottage, demanding that he be given the keys to the house immediately. Alice had said in her letter that Holmes had instructed her to make sure Howard was ready to go somewhere with him. That somewhere would be to this little cottage, and Howard would never leave. The day he rented the house, Holmes spoke to a man named Elvett Mormon, who worked for the owner of the cottage, asking him for assistance in setting up a large wood-burning stove in the newly rented house while little Howard watched. When Elvett Mormon asked Holmes why he didn't just use a gas stove, Holmes informed him that gas wasn't good for young children. On October 8th, Holmes went back to the repair shop to pick up his newly sharpened surgical instruments. At some point after the 8th and before the 10th, Holmes had written to Carrie Peitzel giving her the happy news that her husband was waiting for her in Detroit and that she should now gather up her remaining children and meet him there. On October 9th, Holmes, the ever-doting husband, took Georgiana to the opera, and on October 10th, Howard Peitzel, described by a housemaid as well-mannered and well-dressed, knocked on the door of a nearby house in Irvington asking for food. Apparently, it was his job to find dinner that night for himself and Holmes, and he told her he was new to Irvington and wasn't familiar with the area, so he didn't know where he could go to purchase this food. This housemaid, whose name was Laura, gave him eggs and butter, and he paid her for this food, thanked her, and left. The last time anyone saw Howard alive was 6 p.m. on the evening of the 10th outside the rented cottage in Irvington. It's believed that Holmes arrived shortly after and put poison in the food that Howard had just purchased. Many months later, a bottle of cyanide and wolfsbane were found in the barn adjacent to the cottage, and a few days prior to Howard's death, Holmes had been identified as being the purchaser of a cocaine solution, chloroform, and hydrative chloral. We aren't sure which of these would have been used to kill Howard, but any of them would have done the trick, especially on someone as small as Howard Peitzel. After the little boy was gone, Holmes used his surgical instruments to dismember the body and fed the pieces one by one into the stove, covered in oil, and lit the fire. By 9 p.m., H.H. Holmes was at the train station, and the same evening he checked into a hotel in Chicago. He was only in the city for a day before he returned to Indianapolis to gather up the siblings of the little boy he had just murdered and his wife, Georgiana, who didn't even know he was in charge of these children. And they all got on a train heading for Detroit, Michigan. So when they arrived in Detroit on October 12th, Holmes left Nellie and Alice at the train station while he checked Georgiana into the Hotel Normandy. He then went back for the girls and brought them to the New Western Hotel just a few blocks away. Holmes, Georgiana, and the Peitzel girls only remained at their respective hotels for one night because the next day, on October 13th, Holmes brought Nellie and Alice to the boarding house of Mrs. Burns, located at 91 Congress. And he and Georgiana went to the boarding house of May Ralston at 54 Park Place, arriving with 2 large trunks that they told her were full of costumes since they were both actors. Now, Mrs. Lucinda Burns, who had the girls boarding with her, claimed they were both very quiet, reserved, and incredibly bored. They spent all of their time in the room. October 14th was the date of Alice's last letter, where she said, quote, "Nell and I have both got colds and chapped hands, but that is all. We have not had any nice weather at all. I guess it is coming winter now. Tell Mama that I have to have a coat. I nearly freeze in that thin jacket. We have to stay in all the time. Howard is not with us now. All that Nell and I can do is draw, and I get so tired sitting that I could get up and fly almost. I wish I could see you all. I'm getting so homesick that I don't know what to do. I suppose Wharton walks by this time, don't he? I would like to have him here. He would pass the time a good deal." End quote. Poor little Alice, so homesick, so lonely for her family, had no idea that the mother and siblings she longed to see so badly were just a short walk away, staying at Guise's Hotel under the name the Adams Family. Carrie Peitzel was looking forward to seeing her son, daughters, and husband for the first time in a long while, but Holmes told her that the children were busy with their studies and with school, and it was just too dangerous for her to see her husband Ben just yet, because if he came to their hotel, he could be seen, and the whole plan would be ruined. Carrie Peitzel, in the dark and helpless, had no choice but to follow his lead. Alice and Nellie thought their mother was still in Illinois, staying with their grandparents. Carrie thought Nellie, Alice, and and Howard were in Indianapolis. They were 5 minutes away from each other for 5 days. Had the girls decided to leave their boarding house and go out for a walk at the same time that Carrie decided to do the same, they may have even run into each other, and maybe Holmes's evil plan would have been foiled and the family would have been reunited. Maybe that's why Holmes felt it was time to take Nellie and Alice out of the picture too. On October 15th, Holmes rented a house at 241 East Forest Avenue, telling the owner that it was intended once again for his widowed sister and her children. He also dug a 3-foot deep hole in the backyard. We believe that he intended to kill Alice and Nellie in this house and bury them in the backyard, but something caused him to change his plans. As we discussed in part 2 of the series, he still had people in Chicago who were loyal to him. Most likely, it was Patrick Quinlan. And these people, aka Patrick Quinlan, were keeping him apprised of the progress of several investigations that were going on into his crimes, and it's believed that Holmes received word that law enforcement was hot on his trail, so he abandoned this plan, he grabbed his 3 groups of travelers, and left Detroit. The reason law enforcement was now aware of H.H. Holmes was mostly due to his own big mouth. Marion Hedgepath, the train robber still in prison, saw a way to shorten his 25-year sentence. Remember, it was Marion who had introduced Holmes to Jephthah Howe, the lawyer, who had assisted Holmes with collecting the insurance money and tricking, essentially, Carrie Peitzel into signing over her power of attorney to Holmes. Between Hedgepath and Howe, they had pieced together the fact that Benjamin Peitzel was most likely in fact dead, but he had been murdered for the insurance money by H.H. Holmes. A man named W.E. Gary, who worked as an investigator for the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company, had always felt something was off about the whole Benjamin Peitzel claim. And a few days after Holmes had left with the money, W.E. Gary happened to be in St. Louis on an unrelated matter when he caught wind of a letter that a notorious train-robbing outlaw named Marion Hedgepath had written. And in this letter, Hedgepath claimed his former cellmate had spilled all the tea about his plan to scam Fidelity out of insurance money, but now Marion believed that the joke had actually been on Benjamin Peitzel, that he'd been murdered for the money. Now, this was one attempt out of many to get out of prison for Hedgepath, and no one had paid much attention to his claims, but when Gary heard about it, something clicked in his mind. He claimed there was details in Hedgepath's letter that he could not have possibly known unless Holmes had told him, so he reported his findings to the company's president, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency was brought in to investigate. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was a private agency started in the United States by Alan Pinkerton, a Scotsman who immigrated to Chicago in 1842. In 1847, Pinkerton joined the Chicago Police Department, and 2 years later, he became Chicago's first police detective. The first Pinkerton office opened at 80 Washington Street in Chicago, and they began to work closely with law enforcement to track down and arrest criminals throughout the country. Pinkerton has a long and colorful history, serving as an intelligence agency during the Civil War, protecting trains from bandits. They established the first criminal database and became a forerunner for the U.S. Secret Service, and they also hired the first ever female detective in the United States in 1856, a woman named Kate Warney. If you're a fan of true crime and you haven't looked into the Pinkerton Detective Agency, I highly suggest that you do. But essentially, if you were a criminal, you didn't want to be on their radar because they would not rest until they found you. And they had found Holmes, and they were hot on his trail, but he remained just one step ahead of them. Every time they arrived in a city, they would find he had just recently left. On October 19th, Holmes and his entourage arrived in Toronto, Canada, where he had told Carrie Peitzel that her husband was hiding. He claimed they would stay there only a few days, and then they would travel to Indianapolis, where Carrie would finally see Nellie, Alice, and Howard. Holmes and Georgiana traveled down first on a train, followed by Carrie and her 2 children on a different train, and Alice and Nellie on yet another train, all bound for Toronto. Upon arriving, Holmes checked himself and Georgiana into the Walker House Hotel under the name George Howell and Wife. He then returned to the train station to pick up Carrie, her oldest daughter, and youngest son, and check them into the Union House Hotel. And at 8 p.m. that evening, Alice and Nellie checked into the Albion Hotel. When Carrie asked where her husband was, Holmes told her that Ben had been forced to flee again from the police and he was safe in Montreal. He also gave her a letter he claimed was from the kids, but he had written himself. It said that Howard was busy in school, but they were okay and being cared for and couldn't wait to see her. Holmes told Carrie it would be best if she remained at her hotel for the duration of their stay in Toronto, just in case the police were still sniffing around the city looking for Ben. They might see her, they might recognize her, and then once again the plan would be ruined. But one day, Carrie Peitzel left the hotel and happened to run into Holmes on the street. About this incident, Carrie later said, quote, "I went into a department store on Yonge Street to get some things for the baby. Just after we came out of the dress pattern department onto the street, I met Holmes face to face. He was cool and unconcerned." End quote. Apparently, Holmes told Carrie that he'd been looking for her everywhere, and he asked if she could just wait outside the store a few minutes while he went into the store to purchase a few things before he rejoined her. He then ran into the store and never came back out. Every day while they were in Toronto, Holmes would pick Alice and Nellie up from the Albion Hotel and take them around the city before bringing them back to the hotel in the evening before dinner. And it's suspected that this day he did have the girls with him, which is why he went off in such a hurry and never returned to meet Carrie as he said he would. Afterwards, when Carrie found out what Holmes had done, she felt sure her daughters had been there in that store with him that day and that Holmes had snuck them out a side door so that they would not see each other. On the morning of October 20th, Holmes rented a house at 16 Vincent Street for 6 months, using the same story about needing a house for his widowed sister and her children. After this, he and Georgiana went to Niagara Falls for the day to enjoy the sights. This is what I meant when I said H.H. Holmes seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of Georgiana. We can all admit he had a lot on his plate, right? He had many balls in the air. It most likely would have been easier for him to go about his business if he didn't have a wife to attend to and keep entertained. He could have left her in any of the cities they had previously visited or sent her home to her mother until he was finished, but he chose to keep her with him. And in the end, this weakness, this glimmer of a heart, would contribute to his downfall. When they got back to Toronto on October 21st, they checked into a different hotel, the Palmer House. A few days later, on October 24th, Holmes asked the neighbor of the house on St. Vincent if he had a shovel that could be borrowed to dig a hole for potatoes in the cellar. A hole was dug in the cellar, but it was not for potatoes. After completing this task, Holmes picked up Georgiana and they went to the opera for the evening. The next day, October 25th, Holmes visited Carrie Peitzel at her hotel to tell her that he had spotted 2 policemen in the city hanging around a house he had rented for her, so they had to leave. They had to run once again. This time to Ogdensburg, New York, right across the Canadian border. He told her to get her things packed quickly, but he also told her that he would be taking her large traveling trunk since it would be easier and faster for her to pack lightly. He would send her trunk and the rest of her belongings to her once she was settled in. Carrie, her daughter, and her baby son got on a train to New York, and Holmes picked up Alice and Nellie to bring them to the St. Vincent Street house where he would end their lives. Later, after he was captured, Holmes claimed he had told the girls to climb inside their mother's large trunk, which had a hose attached to it through a hole. The other end of the hose was fastened to the house's gas valve, which, once the trunk was closed, would kill them slowly. In reality, however, there was no gas hookup at the St. Vincent house. And it was more likely that he simply poisoned their food, as he had done with their brother Howard. And then he buried their bodies in the cellar, using that hole he had dug for potatoes. The newspapers would also later report that Nellie's feet had been cut off in an effort to make her body more difficult to identify. But this, too, was just another myth of the H.H. Holmes story, because when the girls' bodies were later found, they were not dismembered. After he killed them, Holmes undressed the girls and put their clothing into the chimney of the house before setting a fire. The next morning, Holmes cheerfully returned the shovel to the neighbor and left Toronto with only the large trunk. A few days later, this neighbor entered the house, and in the cellar, he found loose dirt covered by a few random boards. He wondered, what did this strange man need his shovel for? But he didn't think about it for long, since new tenants were set to arrive, and these new tenants never went into the cellar, claiming there was a horrible smell down there that never went away, no matter what they did. Just after Holmes and Georgiana left Toronto and headed for Burlington, Vermont, the Pinkerton detectives showed up, but this time they would have a stronger trail to follow. It's never really been clear why H.H. Holmes decided to kill Howard, Alice, and Nellie. Some believe it was simply because he enjoyed killing. But there is no proof that H.H. Holmes enjoyed murder, since he only did it when he had something to gain or to protect himself. Author Adam Selzer believes it was because the children knew too much. Alice had seen her father's dead body, and there was no way she could ever be reunited with her mother because then the gig would be up, since her mother thought that Ben was still alive. Alice would tell Carrie that Benjamin Pitezel was actually dead, and Carrie would know Holmes had been lying to her for months, and then she would go to the police. I also think there was simply a convenience factor for him, and also, of course, a financial one. Lugging those kids from city to city, keeping them entertained, it would have been exhausting and also costly. Everywhere they went, he'd have to make sure they had a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs. This would cost money. This would start adding up, and although he had a good amount of money from killing their father, keeping 3 children alive that he didn't care about was most likely not the way he wanted to spend it. While in Vermont, Holmes made some trips to Ogdensburg to check in with Carrie and her 2 surviving children, also not because he cared to make sure they were doing okay, but because he had to keep Carrie calm. He had to keep her thinking that she would soon see her husband and children again. At some point, he told Carrie that they couldn't stay in Ogdensburg because it was such a small town and no one minded their own business and everybody gossiped and had their noses in everyone else's business, so now they had to leave Ogdensburg too. He told her she would have to take a train to Burlington, Vermont, where she would finally be able to see her husband. But how long would he be able to keep this up? How long could he keep making excuses about why Carrie was not able to be reunited with her family before she got suspicious and angry? Most likely, not very long. And most likely, his inevitable plan had been to kill the 3 remaining members of the Pitezel family and leave the country for Berlin, Germany. But he never got the chance. Once Carrie and her children arrived in Vermont, she noticed that Holmes was strung pretty tightly. He'd apparently told her to take the express train, but she'd taken a different train, and when she finally arrived, he was pissed. He yelled at her, why didn't you take the train that I told you to take? And then he told her pretty much like, next time I tell you to do something, you better do exactly what I tell you to do. You better follow my instructions to the T. So he was clearly under some pressure, and you would think he'd be more relaxed, more carefree now that he didn't have 3 children to check into different hotels and take care of and pretend that he actually liked them when he probably never did. But something was bothering him, and that something was the law breathing down his neck. Once he had settled Carrie and her surviving children into a rented house, Holmes took the oldest and only remaining Pitezel daughter out for a day of sightseeing. And while they were out, he kind of casually picked her brain, trying to figure out how much she knew about the scheme that he and Benjamin Pitezel had been creating to defraud the insurance company. He asked her, did your father tell you about the plan that we'd come up with together? And she responded that, yeah, her father had told her, but she hadn't believed it. Holmes then mentioned to her that he would be able to bring her to meet her father, who was hiding out somewhere nearby. But he told Carrie that Ben was back in Toronto in Canada. Later, Carrie would say, quote, "He was always somewhere else. When I asked Holmes several times why I didn't see my husband, he would say he was either sick or drinking. Always when I saw him, I would say, 'Have you heard from the children?' He would say, 'Well, I have not. I do not see why they do not write. I would like to hear from them myself.'" End quote. Now, when Holmes gave Carrie a letter from Ben, she called him out on it, saying, "This is not my husband's handwriting. I would recognize my husband's handwriting, but don't worry, Holmes had an excuse for that too. He always did. He was very quick on his feet when it came to lying. And he was like, yeah, I mean, your husband did write you a letter, but he was so drunk when he wrote you a letter that it was basically illegible. Like you wouldn't have been able to read it. So I just, copied it for you in my own handwriting to do you a favor." At one point, Carrie Pitezel ran out of patience and told Holmes that she was just going to leave. And he was like, don't do that. Give me some more time. But then later she went down into the cellar to find him digging a hole in the dirt floor of the house he had rented for her and the kids. And allegedly he was also nailing boards to the windows. So Clearly, in my opinion, he was planning on killing Carrie and her 2 remaining children. But in the last video, we talked about how Holmes had written to his brother, promising to come home and see his family after years of amnesia. If Holmes had just taken Georgiana and left the States as he had planned to, he would have been free and clear, and the Pinkerton agency would have never found him. Or if they did find him, it would have been out of their jurisdiction and they wouldn't really have been able to do anything about it. But he didn't do that. On the evening of November 5th, a winter storm hit the Northeast, and Holmes told Georgiana he had a business meeting to attend. He took $1,000 and traveled to Gilmanton, New Hampshire, back to where it all started. Back to a family that had thought he was dead. His first stop was the home of Clara Lovering Mudgett, his first wife, who was raising 15-year-old Robert Mudgett by herself. 2 weeks later, the Boston Globe sent a reporter to interview Clara, and she claimed she'd been overjoyed to see her long-lost husband, and believed 100% that he had in fact suffered from amnesia. Even his son, who had never really known his true father, was excited to finally be introduced to him, running through the streets to find someone that they could rent a carriage from on Holmes' request, and shouting, "Father's come home!" Now, the carriage that they wanted to rent was for the Happy family to travel to Herman Mudgett's childhood home where his parents Levi and Theodate still lived. Later, Levi Mudgett talked to a reporter about this family reunion, saying, quote, "After a mysterious absence, my son suddenly drove into our village during an almost blinding evening storm, and like an apparition, as it were, alighted from his carriage, walked softly up to the door of the old Mudgett homestead, and was joyfully welcomed by his aged parents." End quote. To his family and to Clara, Holmes admitted that he had remarried to a lovely woman named Georgiana, having completely forgotten, due to the amnesia, of course, that he was already married. And this story he told is like an old-timey version of a bad Lifetime romantic comedy. He claimed that after an accident that had rendered him unconscious, he was brought to the hospital where he didn't wake up for weeks. The doctors were stumped and they couldn't figure out how to help him. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. And they felt that he would just eventually die from his wounds. But Georgiana, who was a patron of the hospital, convinced the doctors to conduct this risky and experimental surgery on his brain, which saved his life, but left him, sadly, with no memory of who he was or where he had come from. He couldn't even remember his name. Luckily, the hospital gave him one, H. Holmes. He was so grateful to his guardian angel, he married Georgiana, only to be stunned years later when he remembered who he was and that he had people who were waiting for him back at home. Months later, after his arrest, Holmes would write an autobiography in prison while awaiting his trial, and in it he said, quote, "I could not stay here. I felt it was too sacred a place to be entered now, and with tears in my eyes, tears that come again as I write, I reluctantly closed the door and went away." End quote. Now, I haven't mentioned his autobiography before now because we really can't be sure that anything which was written in it was true. H. Holmes lied to everyone about everything. And at the time of writing it, he most likely knew he was headed for the gallows. So it makes sense that he would have wanted to leave behind a more positive impression of himself. You know, the picture of a man who, although he committed heinous acts, was sentimental and had a heart. It's also well known that the man who edited this book after it was written used some creative license. He added portions of his own writing to make it more salacious and to make it seem more well written, so we don't really know if this is the truth. Also, whether Holmes stayed in Gilmanton for a few hours or a few days, we can't be sure, but we do know that the Pinkerton agency had tracked him there, and they were watching and waiting for their moment to pounce. Holmes told his family that he would return to visit them soon, and then he boarded a train heading for Boston and his inevitable arrest. He and Georgiana arrived there on November 13th, and due to his movements, it's believed that he planned to remain in the city for at least a few weeks. The Pinkerton detectives also arrived in Boston to continue following him, but a twist of fate and bad luck had them following a different man for a few days who looked very much like Holmes and who was in the company of a woman who looked very much like Georgiana. Luckily, they figured out pretty quickly that they had made a mistake. They got back on Holmes's trail only to find that he seemed to now be making plans to leave town again. So it was decided that his arrest could no longer wait. They had never been this close, and given his past talents and habits of slipping through their fingers, they might never be this close again. On November 17th, Holmes walked out the front door of his boarding house, hands shoved in pockets and whistling a jaunty tune, to embark on a nice afternoon stroll. Now, to be honest, I don't know if his hands were in his pockets or if he was whistling a jaunty tune, but this is the way I imagine it, so just go with me. 3 Boston policemen, as well as a detective from Pinkerton, were soon strolling right along with him, inviting him for a friendly chat at the police station. Once there, they informed him he was being charged with stealing a horse and also for defrauding the Fidelity Mutual Insurance Company, which he admitted to readily, most likely feeling comforted that they weren't arresting him for one or more of the murders he'd committed. He told the detectives that he had found a body in New York that resembled that of Ben Peitzel, and then Ben himself had helped him stage the scene to make it appear as if he had died in an accident. When asked where Benjamin Peitzel actually was, Holmes claimed that he and his 3 children, Nellie, Howard, and Alice, were hiding out in South America together. Although the detectives believed that Benjamin Peitzel was actually no longer alive and that Holmes had killed him, they really had no evidence of this and they couldn't charge him with murder. Not yet, at least. Georgiana Yoke was also brought in to be questioned, and the police told her what her husband had been up to. They also told her that she wasn't really married to him, since he already had a wife named Clara Lovering and another wife named Murda. But after being fed charismatic lies for so long, when she confronted Holmes with this information and he lied, saying he thought Clara was dead, Georgiana believed him, as she had done so many times before. Detectives went to Burlington, Vermont, and brought Carrie Peitzel and her children to the police station in Boston, where she too was arrested, even though Holmes, for his part, had told the police officers that she had nothing to do with the scam. It's reported that when she arrived at the police station, Carrie fainted. A Boston Herald reporter who witnessed her arrival wrote, quote, "She appeared at headquarters a worn-out, worried woman, and the news which she received there did not help ease her mind," end quote. The story of Holmes made national news, and he and Carrie were transferred to Philadelphia to be tried for insurance fraud. In Philadelphia, his statement was taken, and the police chief let him know that despite all his stories, unless they were able to locate Benjamin Peitzel alive, he would be considered dead. To which Holmes responded, "I understand it. I don't care how soon Peitzel is brought to the front now. I certainly don't want to be held for murder. While I am bad enough on smaller things, I am not guilty of that." End quote. The problem was, over the following year and a half, Holmes's story constantly changed, and as each month passed with no sign of Ben Peitzel or his 3 children, the authorities became more and more sure that they were no longer alive. At some point, Holmes was asked about Minnie Williams and her sister Nanny, and according to Philadelphia police detective Thomas Crawford, who had been sent to fetch Holmes from Boston and bring him to Pennsylvania, he was told by Holmes that Minnie Williams was dead, but it had not been at his hands. Crawford told the Philadelphia Record, quote, "He went to Chicago with his wife, and while there he fell in love with a young girl, a typewriter from Fort Worth, Texas. The girl became infatuated with him, and he furnished a house for her. The girl had an elder sister who came to live with her. The younger sister became jealous of the newcomer, and they quarreled. The younger sister, in a fit of rage, picked up a stool and brained the other with it. When Holmes reached the house, he found the elder sister dead. To shield the murderess, he put the dead body in a trunk and, piling in a lot of stones to make it heavy, took it to Lake Michigan and sunk it. The murderess owned property at Fort Worth valued at $40,000. Holmes took this property off her hands, giving her enough money to take her abroad, where she is now." End quote. So obviously, we can only conclude that Holmes did in fact kill both Minnie and Nanny Williams. Or he would not have told this fabricated story, placing him in the position of an accomplice. He knew they were both dead. Or he would have just told the investigators that he had no idea where they were, which would have been the truth. And this was pretty much the general consensus, that they were dead and he had done it, especially amongst people who had known the sisters and didn't believe that either would kill the other, especially Nanny, who was very sweet and mild-mannered. Now, those who had known Minnie thought it was possible she might have taken her sister out in a fit of jealous rage, which also lends credibility due to Minnie's personality that she may have actually been involved in the murder of her sister before having Holmes turn on her as well. But once again, we really can't be sure what her involvement was, only that she most likely ended up a victim herself. This was the story Holmes stuck to for roughly a year, but later, maybe after realizing it made him look bad, he changed his stance on the Williams sisters several times, saying they were both alive as far as he knew, and he had just told Thomas Crawford a tall tale because the man seemed gullible and Holmes thought it would be fun to mess with him. Reporters from all over began journeying around to find those who knew Holmes, or Mudgett, as he was now being called because that was his actual and legal name. They even went to Gilmanton to interview Clara and the Mudgetts, who could not believe it was their son being talked about in all of the papers. The press went to Chicago and interviewed Charles E. Davis, the jeweler who operated out of the first floor of the castle, who was quoted as saying, "Holmes was lavish with money when he could get it. He must have made $200,000 when he was here, but I believe it is all gone. In fact, from what I know of the man, I am inclined to believe that he would never have attempted this alleged insurance fraud if he had not been very hard up. But I don't believe it was a fraud in the sense of the dispatches. I should not be surprised if that was the Peitzel body that was burned and if Holmes knew all about his death." End quote. Davis also suggested to the paper that the basement of the Holmes building had a dirt floor, and that it might be a good idea to dig it up in order to uncover any secrets Holmes had stashed down there. Davis said, quote, "I don't know anything, but I believe the mystery of the disappearance of Minnie Williams and her sister might be solved by digging in the cellar." End quote. It was almost as if Charles Davis had just been waiting for someone to arrive and ask him about H.H. Holmes, because that wasn't all he told the papers. He also informed them that Holmes had installed a vault on the second floor, and if someone was inside and the door was closed, their screams would never be heard. Davis also said that Holmes had an elevator that went from his floor to the basement, and it might make it easy to move things around without anyone seeing. Myrta Holmes, still in Wilmette with her 5-year-old daughter, was also questioned by multiple reporters, but her official statement seems to still be in question. A reporter from the Herald claimed she seemed unbothered by the whole thing and had told him, quote, "Naturally, I know a great deal of Mr. Holmes's business. I do not intend to be interviewed about it, for it is his business and no one else's. I have no doubt he will clear himself of all accusations if given a fair opportunity. Every businessman has enemies, and Mr. Holmes has some who would like to overwhelm him. As for him having another wife, I do not believe it. I have the utmost confidence in him. Our domestic relations have been pleasant. Mr. Holmes left the 1st of January and has been here twice since then on brief visits, and I was with him during the winter on one of his business trips south. We have one child, a little daughter, and have been married about 9 years. I hear from my husband 2 and 3 times a week, and he continually sends me money for my needs and wants. That does not look like there being trouble between us, does it?" End quote. But another reporter went back to Myrta the next day to question her, and she angrily told this reporter that she had not given any interviews and had spoken to no reporters. And she wouldn't even speak to this new reporter besides to tell him off and ask him to leave. Maybe she had sung the Stand By Your Man story to the Herald reporter. And maybe now she realized how idiotic it sounded once she saw it in print, and she didn't want to make the same mistake. Or maybe she never said it at all, and an overzealous reporter had made it up instead of going back to his editor empty-handed without a story. The world may never know. A few things happened in December. First, Georgiana surrendered to the authorities a box that had belonged to her husband. Inside were several pairs of keys to different rental houses. There were also letters from Alice and Nellie Peitzel that Holmes had never mailed, and letters from Carrie Peitzel to her children that he had never delivered. It was these items that would eventually lead Philadelphia police detective Frank Geyer on a scavenger hunt for the missing Peitzel children. Also on December 27th, Holmes gave his second confession, changing his story that Benjamin Peitzel was still alive. He claimed that he had come up with the insurance scheme in the summer of 1893, but when it was time to get the real Benjamin away and replace him with the body that Holmes had purchased in New York, he found his buddy Ben in quite a state, depressed and drunk, saying that he just wished he could drink himself to death and end it all. According to the second confession, when Holmes returned the next morning to enact the plan, he found Peitzel had taken his own life, leaving behind a letter explaining what he had done and why he had done it, but telling Holmes that he had to destroy this letter after he was done reading it so nobody would ever know. Of course, it's like Inspector Gadget. Holmes panicked, realizing that their whole plan would be foiled since Fidelity didn't pay out for suicides. So he posed the body, the real body, of Benjamin Peitzel to make it appear as if Ben had died accidentally. So his new story was that Ben was now actually dead. But when he was asked about the children, Holmes claimed they were with Minnie Williams in London, and that all the detectives had to do was go to New York City, where Minnie and the children had started their voyage to England, and ask around, and he was sure somebody had seen them and could point them out and identify them, which is crazy because a year before he'd said that Minnie Williams had been killed by Nanny Williams and he had helped dispose of the body. So he's constantly changing his story, constantly lying. He lied so much, I don't even think he could remember what he had lied about before. On May 27th, Holmes went on trial for insurance fraud and pleaded not guilty, but the next day he changed and pleaded guilty because most likely his lawyers had told him the most he could serve in jail for this crime was 2 years. The judge accepted this plea, but directly afterwards, Holmes was brought into District Attorney George Graham's office for a meeting. And there he was pretty much told, hey, we still think you killed Benjamin Peitzel, and we still think you killed his kids. And the only way we aren't going to think that and pursue murder charges against you is if you tell us where they are. Holmes once again denied that the Peitzel children were dead, but he told Graham that he believed Minnie Williams had opened a massage parlor in London, and the kids would most likely be with her there. Graham told him, quote, I believe your entire story to be a lie from beginning to end. End quote. But he still allowed an ad to be placed in the paper on June 2nd, 1894. And this ad was a coded message from Holmes to Minnie Williams telling her to return the children at once. Now, while they waited for Minnie's response, Scotland Yard in London was contacted and asked to check into this massage parlor, but it turned out there was no massage parlor. Like most everything else Holmes said, it had been a lie meant to buy time. Now, I want to touch on Georgiana quickly. I genuinely believe that she was duped by Holmes, like so many others. Apparently, she had gotten it into her head that she wanted to talk to Murda Holmes, and she was like going to drive out to Wilmette and have a conversation with this woman, but Patrick Quinlan talked her out of it, basically telling her, if you go there, Murda's going to rip you to shreds. In general, Georgiana seemed very depressed and down about this turn of events since she had truly believed all of her husband's crazy stories and lies. She wrote to Holmes while he was in prison telling him that his business associates, including Patrick Quinlan, had told her that Holmes was more in love with Murda than he was with her. She said in this letter, quote, I loved you with the one love of a lifetime until your past was known, but my regard for you has changed to a feeling of pity with some of the old, deep love. I have sometimes thought harsh things when I have suffered so for your love and kindly attention, have been consumed by jealousy until I felt I must destroy you and that other woman. End quote. So it almost makes me wonder, do you think Georgiana wanted to go to Wilmette to talk to Murda, or to destroy her? Even after all of this, though, Georgiana promised Holmes she would never ask him for a divorce, which she probably couldn't have asked him for anyways because they weren't actually married, but she did spend her days crying, unable to eat, and requesting that he send her long letters. It's so sad. Oh, it's so sad. Even though Holmes had written a letter to Carrie Peitzel from jail claiming that he had not harmed her children, she did not believe him. She told a local paper, quote, "I can't believe that they are alive, or they would have written to me. Holmes would do anything. He has lied to me and cheated me, and I would not put it past him to make away with the children if it would do him any good." End quote. While Carrie Peitzel was heartsick over her missing children, Detective Frank Geyer set out to locate them, or at least to discover what their fates had been. Frank Geyer was intelligent and devoted to his craft. And before he set out, he talked to law enforcement officials on the Holmes case so that he pretty much knew every nook and cranny of the con man, who he was, where he had been, and what he was capable of. Before he left, Frank Geyer actually met with Holmes, who told him about a new player in this crazy game, a man named Edward Hatch, who was a bricklayer in Chicago. And Holmes claimed he had given this man the task of delivering the children to Minnie Williams. Holmes was like, I think the kids are still alive, as far as I know, but if they're dead, it's most likely Edward Hatch who's the culprit. This was a last-ditch attempt on his part to try and throw Geyer off the scent, or at least distract him for long enough to buy some more time. Because Holmes knew full well that the children were dead, and he hadn't worked that hard to cover it up or to ensure that their remains would not be found. On June 26th, Geyer left Philadelphia and traveled to Cincinnati, where he wandered around hotels showing pictures of Holmes and the Peitzel children to the clerks and to the managers, but he was getting no leads. Next, he went to Indianapolis, where a local police officer pointed him in the direction of the Circle House Hotel, whose manager did remember the children being there. He especially remembered how often they cried for their mother. After this, Geyer went to Chicago to question associates of Holmes and to track down this bricklayer, Edward Hatch. Here, Geyer spoke with Patrick Quinlan, who claimed that he had known the Peitzel children, and if it was true that Ben Peitzel was no longer alive, it was more than likely the children were dead as well, and he would like to see Holmes hang for it. When asked about Edward Hatch, Quinlan admitted he did know a bricklayer in Chicago who went by that name, but this was a good and hard-working man, and if Holmes was trying to pin this on him, he was a dirty, lying scoundrel. Next, Frank Geyer went to Detroit, where he found a house that Holmes had rented with a hole dug in the backyard, but there was nothing buried in that hole. After this, he traveled on to Toronto, and he spent several days working with local law enforcement there trying to trace Holmes's movements, but he found nothing. He was about ready to give up and head back to Philadelphia when he got a tip. The local papers in Toronto had been trying to help him by printing the story, asking anyone who knew anything to come forward, and someone had come forward. The neighbor of the St. Vincent Street house where Holmes had taken the lives of Nellie and Alice Peitzel. On July 15th, Geyer arrived to the house and spoke with its new tenants, who informed him that they'd been unable to use the cellar since they'd moved in because no matter how much it was cleaned, there was still a horrible smell coming from it. They had also found partially burnt clothing in the chimney, as well as unburned clothing hidden under the sink in the kitchen, and a child's small wooden toy. Geyer and another detective went into the cellar, and in a book he would later write about his investigation, he said, quote, "Forcing the spade into the earth, we found easy digging, and after going down about 1 foot, a horrible stench arose. The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of a human being." End quote. The badly decomposed bodies were removed, one by one. Nellie was on top of her sister, and Alice lay beneath her, face up and in fetal position. When H.H. Holmes was notified of this discovery, he said, quote, "Well, I guess they'll hang me for this." End quote. District Attorney Graham told the press he would be trying Holmes for murder, and on July 18th, Carrie Peitzel arrived in Chicago to identify the bodies of her children, and she made a statement to the press. She said, quote, "Holmes, who I had never met but once before the death of my husband, seemed from the time he asked me for the care of the children until his final arrest to have a peculiar influence over me. I felt controlled by him. The children idolized him. There was nothing that he could not do with them. Again and again, my husband told me how much he thought of Holmes and how honorable he was, until I came to the same opinion myself. Although at first I did not like the man and told my husband so and begged him to have nothing to do with him." End quote. On August 27th, little Howard's remains were also discovered, burned and charred, shoved into the chimney in the cellar of the Irvington house. The previous month, workers in the basement of Holmes's Chicago castle found 2 sets of bones in the basement and cellar. Both of these bones were surrounded by quicklime. The first set was roughly 7 or 8 bones found with matted bits of hair and what appeared to be a cape or a coat, along with some pieces of an old trunk. The bones were brought upstairs to the pharmacy where Dr. Robinson confirmed they were human bones and he believed they were from a child between the ages of 6 and 8. Julia Connor's nephew told reporters he truly believed the bones were that of his cousin Pearl. The other set of bones was just a torso found in the cellar underneath a set of stairs. Holmes's lawyer claimed these bones were simply what remained of an insurance plot from years ago when his client had partnered with a man whose death they were going to fake. But this man wanted to disappear with his wife and child, so he and his partners needed to find 3 bodies. This is the same plot that we talked about in part 1 of this series, so it's very possible that this could actually be the truth. To add another layer of intrigue, Holmes claimed an old professor of his from medical school had helped him acquire these bodies, a Dr. Herdman. This same professor who had voted against him graduating. It's more than likely Dr. Herdman had nothing to do with Holmes's plot. Him being named by Holmes was most likely because Holmes was still salty that he tried to prevent him from graduating. Allegedly, once the scam had fallen through, Holmes needed to do something with the bodies, so he buried them in the cellar in the basement. Mrs. Lawrence, wife of Dr. Lawrence, believed the bones could have belonged to the Connors or to the Williams sisters or even to Emmeline Sagrand, who she was sure Holmes had done away with. These summer months were the first time that Holmes's building in Chicago started being called the Castle, with newspapers all over the country taking creative license with the story in an attempt to create clickbaity headlines. The first time it was ever suggested that Holmes used this building as a hotel to lure travelers to, only to kill them, was on August 1st in the Philadelphia Press. The press claimed they had a source in Chicago that wanted to remain anonymous who had told them they should get a list of all those who had gone missing during the World's Fair because they would bet their lives these people had found their end in Holmes's building. Even though there was never any proof or evidence of this, the idea of Holmes building a hotel specifically to murder World's Fair patrons became embedded in his legend, growing every time it was retold. In late September of 1895, Holmes stood before Judge Finletter for his arraignment. His appearance had quickly gone downhill. His face was pale and sickly looking. His eyes were sunken, and his normally neatly trimmed mustache had transformed into a scraggly, unkempt beard. He stood before the court and simply said, "I am not guilty, sir." But his trial was scheduled to start on October 28th anyways. The trial would become a circus, as most of these famous ones do, with people crowding outside to get a glimpse of the murderous conman or any of the witnesses who were being brought in to testify against him. But only lawyers, jurors, and reporters were allowed into the courtroom for the actual trial. During the trial, Holmes at first basically dismissed his 2 lawyers, deciding to represent himself, which has worked for no one ever. Just ask Ted Bundy. And this ploy would not work for H.H. Holmes either. Luckily for him, Holmes only had to act on his own behalf during jury selection before realizing that he was out of his depths. And he brought back his lawyers to help him for the rest of the trial. His 3rd wife, Georgiana, testified against him. And there's actually a very good book written about this called A Competent Witness by Judith Nichols. However, Holmes's 2nd wife, Murda, turned out to be the most credible witness in his support. She told the jury that although her husband may have done some illegal things in business, no one could ever convince her that he was a murderer. He'd always been a good husband to her, a good father to Lucy, and a competent provider who was gentle and good and loved animals. Carrie Peitzel also took the stand, a ghost of the woman she had once been, avoiding looking at the murderer of her husband and children, except for 2 times when she was forced to identify him. At the end of the prosecution's portion of the trial, Holmes's lawyers claimed they didn't feel they needed to do much since the prosecution had failed to make its case that their client was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite their confidence, the jury found H.H. Holmes guilty of murder on November 3, 1895, after only 3 hours of deliberation. At his sentencing hearing on November 30th, Holmes's petition for a new trial was denied and he was sentenced to death by hanging. According to the website svjlit.com, Holmes became a vegetarian afterwards in prison. He also became friends with a mouse in his cell who he trained. He became Catholic because, as we've talked about before, most criminals find God when they're facing their own mortality behind bars. He was sent to Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia to await his execution, which would happen 6 months later on May 7, 1896. On the last day of his life, it's reported that Holmes woke up early at 5:30 a.m. and greeted his jailer with a happy good morning. When asked if he felt nervous, Holmes responded, "Not at all," and then ate a large breakfast with coffee. A little after 10 a.m., Holmes climbed a short flight of stairs to the 8-foot-high gallows and stood over the trapdoor that soon would be dropped out from underneath him after the rope was placed around his neck. Previously, while behind bars, the condemned man had spoken to a great many people, including writers and editors, and he'd created an autobiography where he confessed to 27 murders. As he stood on the gallows, Holmes cried out that everything in the book had been a lie, and that he was innocent of all crimes besides 2 botched operations, which had resulted in the death of Julia Connors and Emmeline Cigrand. The superintendent of the prison placed a leather mask over his head, and then, having some trouble putting the rope around his neck, Holmes casually told him, "Take your time. I'm in no hurry." At 10:13 a.m., a lever was pulled, and the floor beneath Holmes's feet dropped. It is believed that he probably died within 20 seconds, but his fingers continued to twitch for almost 15 minutes. We can thank the newspapers of the time for how sensationalized H.H. Holmes became, how his legend transformed from your run-of-the-mill con artist who killed a handful of people that were in his way to a savage serial killer who killed simply because he enjoyed it. The papers printed exaggerations for the most part and sometimes outright lies. Although Holmes confessed to many murders, very few of them have ever been proven. I think he wanted his legend to live on after him, which is why he created so many stories and admitted to murders that he most likely had not committed. I think what other people thought of him was always very important to Holmes. He was always trying to appear to be the good guy, someone who was only trying to help everyone out and do what was best for them, selfless and courteous, a true Victorian gentleman. This image was not only important to the successes of his many schemes, leading people to believe he was a good, upstanding citizen with a strong moral compass, so they would feel comfortable entrusting him with their money and their lives, but I believe it was also imperative to his sense of self. Why else would he have returned to his hometown of Gilmanton with a story for his family to explain his long absence? Why else would he have given his parents money and brought Clara and their son presents and words of love? Maybe he did have a glimmer of a soul after all. Maybe he did feel guilt and regret, which is not the sign of a psychopath, as he's often been described. America's first serial killer is not an accurate representation for what H.H. Holmes was, in my opinion. I think America's first gaslighter is a much better description. Many who knew him described a feeling of being hypnotized, of going along with things simply because he told them to. The superintendent of the prison Holmes was housed at said, quote, "He's got the slickest, oiliest voice on earth. Slick, why that hardly describes it. Why, he'd make you believe black was white and green or anything else you want to call it." End quote. Holmes knew how to manipulate people. He knew how to convince them that what they were seeing with their own eyes and knew with their own minds was not the truth at all. He was attempting to rewrite the facts for people, and because he was so good in his gaslighting, he was successful in that, at least, for a while. But let me know what you think about H.H. Holmes. It's often been said in a lot of books and articles on him that have been written that he is known to have killed 20-something people, but he could have killed hundreds. I definitely don't think that he killed hundreds. I don't even think that he killed the 27 that he admitted to. I do believe he killed Minnie and Nanny Williams. I also do believe he killed Julia Connors and her daughter Pearl. I think he killed Emmeline Segrand, definitely the Peitzel children, as well as Benjamin Peitzel himself. And I definitely think that he would have killed Mrs. Peitzel and the other 2 Peitzel children. But I don't think he just randomly went around thinking, who can I kill today? Who can I lure to my hotel that doesn't even have beds in it and kill them? Definitely don't think that happened. So it's definitely a legend that kind of just was built over the years, which often happens and is understandable. But hopefully in these videos, we've set the record as straight as it can be. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thinking of going live this coming Friday so we can talk about H.H. Holmes and other things if you want. So let me know in the comments if you want to do that. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the video. Hit the like button if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. And don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already. And if you are already subscribed, make sure you still are, because YouTube's always unsubscribing people from my channel. They hate true crime. But what are you going to do? That's what I'm here for. Don't forget to check out Native in the description box, and my social media handles are also in the description box if you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Thank you so much for being here. Coffee and Crime Times will be returning this coming week. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay spooky, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's killing you slowly, and so you got to let it go. I got blood